Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Sheviit. We are up to Perek Tet Mishnah Vav. Today's Mishnah should be Le'nishmat Neria ben Svetlana Aranbai Menuchato Began Eden. Amen. Today's Mishnah is going to continue discussing the biur deadlines of other types of plants. The Mishnah says, Hamelaket Asavim Lachim Ad Shiva Shematok. If one gathers fresh, moist grasses and brings them into his home, he may use them, which is to eat or feed them to his animals, only until the moisture of the Shemitah rain has dried up. Literally, hamatok means the sweet, but the Rav says that the moisture in the ground is called sweet because it sweetens and ripens the produce. So the Mishnah is telling us, if you gather fresh, moistened grass and bring them into your house, you can use them only until the moisture of the Shemitah rain dries up, because at that point we assume that all the moist grasses in the field have also dried up and become inedible even to the animals. Now, the Mepharshim explain that this time of until the moisture dries up is not an absolute deadline. It's just a rule of thumb that you can use to figure out the deadline, meaning while the ground is still moist, you can assume that fresh grass is available to wild animals. But once the ground dries up, you can assume that fresh grass is no longer available. However, if you know for sure that fresh grasses can be found even after the ground has dried up, they're not subject to biur. The same is true of the biur deadlines of the Mishnah's cases for dry grasses, reed leaves, and grapevine leaves. The Mishnah continues, Vam gabev bayavesh. If one gathers dry grasses, ad shetered revi'ah shniya, he may continue using them until the second rains of the 8th year, because those rains make dry grasses of Shemitah unfit for the animals. What exactly is this Revi'ah Shniya, second rains? The Rab tells us that in Eretz Yisrael, the rainy season begins with 3 major rainfalls. On average, the second rainfall occurs on the 23rd of the month of Mar Cheshvan. Now, we see from this Mishnah, the Mepharshim explained to us that the Mishnah clearly views fresh and dry grasses as distinct species, each one with its own biur deadline. And the reason for this is because they differ greatly from each other in taste and appearance. Therefore, even though dry grass is found in the fields until the second rainfall of the 8th year, that has no bearing on the biur of fresh grasses, which become unfit for wild animals as soon as the ground dries up in the spring or summer of Shemitah. However, the Art School Elucidated quotes the Chazon Ish, who explains this distinction applies only to the grass and leaves mentioned in this Mishnah. Other species have a single biur deadline for both fresh and dry produce. The Mishnah continues, Ale kanim v'ale gifanim. If one gathers fresh leaves of reeds and fresh leaves of grapevines, ad she'yishu me'avihen, he may use them in his home until they fall from their branches, at which point they become unfit for animals. And Vashim explain, wild animals eat fresh leaves of reeds and grapevines right off the plant, and they will not eat them after they have fallen to the ground. According to what we said, the biur deadline for these species arrives when the reeds and the grapevines shed their leaves and they fall to the ground, because then the animals will not eat them. Biur is required even if at this point, even if the dry leaves can still be found in the fields. Again, dry leaves the animals do eat from the ground. Even if they can still be found in the fields, you still have to perform biur. Why? Because just like in the case of grasses, fresh and dry leaves are considered separate species because they have different taste and different appearance. But if one gathers dry leaves, he may use them until the second rains of the 8th year, because those rains make the dry leaves of Shemitah unfit for animals. Rabbi Akiva says, Bikulan, in all of these cases of grasses and leaves, whether they are dry, whether they are fresh, one may use them until the second rains of the 8th year, because the Chazon Ish again explains, unlike the first Tana, Rabbi Akiva views moist and dry grasses as the same species. Therefore, as long as any grasses at all, whether moist or dry, can be eaten by wild animals, all the grasses are permitted. The same thing would apply to the leaves. And the Rav tells us, En halakha ki Rabbi Akiva, the halakha does not follow Rabbi Akiva. And that is the end, Rabotai, of Mishnah Vav. Mishnah Zayin now is going to cite other situations. Some have nothing to do with Shemitah. where a deadline is marked by the second rains. Once we started speaking about second rains as a deadline, we're going to give more cases of second rains being a deadline, even though it has nothing to do with Shemitah. Mishnah Zayin. Kayotze bo hamaskir bayit lechavero ad hageshamim ad shetered revia shniya. Similarly, if one person rents a house to another and he specifies that the lease should last until the rains, this means that the lease lasts until the second rains fall, and he may not evict the tenant before them. The Mefarshim explain that the plural form of gishamim refers to the second rainfall of the season. Likewise, hamodar hana'a mechavero ad gishamim ad shetered revia shniya. If someone is prohibited by a neder to benefit from another person, and it is specified that this prohibition lasts until the rains, that means the prohibition will remain in force until the second rains fall. And the Mefarshim explain, again, just to understand what exactly is a neder. A neder is a vow by which a person can prohibit things that would otherwise be mutar. For example, if someone said about another person, any benefit from him is forbidden to me, he will not be allowed to benefit from that person. So Mishnah is telling us, if he specified until the rains, that means he cannot benefit until the second rains fall. Now, Rabotai, during the harvest season, poor people are allowed to enter private fields to gather the gifts of the poor, which means the portions of the crop that the Torah obligates the owner to give to the poor people, which we explained earlier on in the earlier Masechtot. Leket, the stocks that fell during the harvest. Shicha, sheaves or stocks that were forgotten in the field. Pe'ah, a corner of the field. These are gifts that must be left unharvested or left for the poor to take. The Mishnah's ruling obviously also applies to people in private fields in the 8th year to collect whatever Shemitah produce remains in them. The Mishnah now is going to define to us the point when this permission no longer applies. Ad ematai aniyim nichnesim lepardesot. Until when may poor people enter other people's orchards and fields to gather the gifts of the poor? Ad shetered revia shniya, until the second rains fall. From the time that the second rains fall, seeds of the new crops begin to sprout, and walking on the land harms the newly growing plants, and therefore the poor people will not be allowed to enter other people's orchards and fields to gather the gifts of the poor. Now, Rabotai, the Mishnah is going to continue discussing stubble and straw that grew during Shemitah had Shemitah sanctity. Why? Because they can be fed to animals. Therefore, one is forbidden to use them in a destructive manner, like as fuel for a fire. The Mishnah now is going to define when this prohibition to use a stubble and straw as fire will stop applying. And how do we know that you are not allowed to use it for fuel or fire? The pasuk in the Torah says in Sefer Vayikra, chapter 25, pasuk 6, the uncultivated produce of the land shall be for you to eat. This pasuk teaches that the produce of Shemitah is yours to eat, but not to destroy or waste, meaning it is forbidden to use Shemitah produce in a way that it is destroyed before it provides benefit. For example, you cannot use it as fuel for a fire. Why? Because a fire does not give off heat until after the straw has been destroyed and converted into charcoal. So the Mishnah now is going to tell us when this prohibition stops applying. From when may we benefit from or burn stubble and straw of Shemitah? From when the second rains fall in the 8th year. At that point, the straw and the stubble in the fields become unfit for animals to eat, and therefore a person has to perform bi'ur with the straw and stubble that he has in his house. Once the bi'ur has been performed with them, the straw and the stubble lose their Shemitah sanctity, and therefore they can be used even in a destructive manner. Now, according to this explanation of the Mishnah, the article elucidated brings down, it appears that this is a general rule, meaning once biur has been performed with Shemitah produce, it loses its Shemitah sanctity and may be destroyed. But the Mefarshim point out that if you're going to learn like this, it's difficult to understand why the Mishnah only said this by straw and stubble and not all the other examples. But in any event, Rabotai, that is the end of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen.